The National Gallery of Art in London, England, holds a number of masterpieces of great works. Great paintings by artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Rubens, Rembrandt, Vermeer. That is quite a collection. I'd like to introduce you to one particular painting in the National Gallery there in London at Trafalgar Square. One artwork that I think offers us quite a bit to think about. As you prepare to look at this painting, I ask you to keep in mind two main questions. What am I looking at? What am I seeing? What are the pieces that the artist is using to try and grab my attention? How do we, when we look at things like this, make sense of the visual stuff in front of us? The second question to ask yourself is, how does it make me feel? Does it speak to me at deeply emotional levels? Or perhaps not at all? When you look at these paintings, and the one in particular I'm going to show you, ask yourself if you can identify with any of these works, or at least the pieces of these great works. Do they speak to you somehow? You have a wide range of options to consider when you look at great works. So take your time and consider these two questions. What do you see, and what do you feel? What does your eye say, and what does your heart say? Sometimes great art can speak to us even when we may not think of it as having much to say. The more we get to know about it, perhaps the deeper it can speak. Let's explore one example. It is a painting of Jesus and Mary Magdalene on Easter Sunday morning. The story is recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. The artist that I will be showing you today is a 16th century painter from Venice, Italy. We know him by the name of Titian. Titian is considered one of the great artists of an era known as the Italian Renaissance. The title of the painting is Noli me Tangere. Those are the words that Jesus says to Mary when he meets her in the garden on Sunday morning. Mary, do not touch me. Noli me tangere. That's Latin. I don't think Jesus spoke much Latin in those days, but in any way it makes for a good title for a wonderful painting like this. It's the story of Mary Magdalene, who has come to the tomb on Easter morning to anoint Jesus' body with oil. That's part of the Jewish ritual for burial. But Mary Magdalene cannot find Jesus' body. And so, seeing a gardener working nearby, she asks the gardener, "Can you tell me where they've laid Jesus' body?" And at that very moment, Jesus, who seems to be appearing like a gardener, reveals his identity to her. "Mary, it's me." And Mary reaches out to touch him. And Jesus says, "Noli me tangere, do not touch me." I think a more accurate translation would be, don't cling to me. Because Jesus goes on to say, I have not yet ascended to the heavens. And you can see Jesus gently pulling away. The first thing that I'd like for you to notice when you look at this art is this rich landscape that we have before us. It is an outdoor landscape painting with some figures in the foreground, a man and a woman. There is a lot to look at when you just let your eye sort of roam all over this rich imagery. If your eyes are like mine, the first thing you see are the two figures at the very front of this painting. That's probably where most of us focus our attention early on. But don't forget, there's a lot of material around those two individuals. So let's start by looking at the background. You see in the background some hills. Visually speaking, you could say there's an imaginary line separating the sky from the earth. The artistic device that Titian is employing is called a horizon line. The horizon line is a good way of determining where you, the viewer, are oriented as you stand in front of this painting. It's always a good place to begin. Where does the eye see normal space, earth and land? Sometimes horizon lines can be very high, up near the top. Or maybe they're in the middle. Sometimes they're even down low near the bottom. The artist has lots of choices. The concept of horizon line first appeared during the Renaissance, and it became very popular with art lovers. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan uses the horizon line very effectively. He's able to connect the 12 disciples and Jesus in the foreground with the landscape we see in the background outside the window. Without the people in the room, we can see how realistic this spacious indoor setting looks to us. With the horizon line appearing across the top of the hills, our eye now shifts to the blue sky in the distance. Renaissance painters were among the very first to begin to understand that the farther back you go in space, the grayer or the bluer or the fainter the image will look. Our modern mind knows that trees and forests are green, but when you understand the sense of going toward the background, going away from what's in front of you, things receding into the distance are a bit more gray. They're a bit lighter bluish. They're not the same color as in the foreground. We have mountains back in North Carolina where I grew up called the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River.
Those Blue Ridge Mountains sure look blue to me when I saw them in a car driving by them. But when my parents got up close to those Blue Ridge Mountains, I noticed they weren't blue at all. They were green. And I also noticed when I looked behind me on the other set of mountains going towards Tennessee, those mountains were called the Smoky Mountains. Things there in the distance were said to look more like smoke, hiding them in a vague haze. When you're 7 years old, that can be very confusing. I'd like for you to notice two things about this part of this work. The first is the way Titian uses light, and the second is the way Titian uses line. In these two techniques, we begin to grasp his meaning, his genius, and the significance of this painting. So the first thing to notice is the way that the early morning light is illuminating the images, both the background and the foreground. You see those bright bursts of sunlight illumining the sky above? As your eye begins to move downward, you will begin to see some sections with less light and the beginnings of shadows, just what we might expect at daybreak. The shrubbery and shadow on the right. The trees cast shadows in a pasture on our left. Shrubbery, shadows on the lower left. Shadows give depth. They give us volume. They suggest movement and direction. Look at Mary's dress. Her dress even hints at some shadow. Subtle shades of dark highlight the red. And along the front fringes of her flowing robe, faint shadows on the ground make her presence stand out. Titian's use of light and shadow illustrate a very complex understanding of light's dynamics, and yet he makes it look so natural. For centuries, scientific understanding of light by painters was not known. Look at this example of an earlier Italian painting from the medieval period of around 1300. Same scene, Mary Magdalene and Jesus Easter morning. But everything here is brightly lit. There's no depth. There's no Blue Ridge Mountains. There's no Smoky Mountains in the distance. Even with efforts by the artist of multiple levels of terrain, there's not much distance, not much darkness or shadow. In fact, it's hard to find any shadows anywhere, especially in a setting when you'd expect to see some. Light conveys mood. The mood of this painting is one of light and shadow, but peace and tranquility, a very natural time of day, are evident. When you consider how much violence has been done to Jesus in the last 48 hours, you could imagine his body being pretty well brutally beaten and holes everywhere in his body on Good Friday, a brutal crucifixion, a spear placed in his side, nails in his feet and his hands, a crown of thorns placed on his head and face, the anger of the crowd, the calls for violence. All that is now past. In fact, Titian emphasizes this point by eliminating all the signs of wounds on Jesus' body. There's just a bit of a slight clue on Jesus' foot. Do you see his right foot in the foreground? We see only the single mark of one nail. Light for Titian is a way to convey that which is positive and good. And overall, his mood is serenity and peace. The second thing I'd like you to notice in this painting is Titian's use of line. He uses line as a painterly tool, as an invisible way to define a particular space, or perhaps more importantly, to create a relationship between images, especially people. We've seen this horizon line. We notice that the top half of the painting represents perhaps the divine realm of the heavens, the sky and the light and the clouds. Even over to the right side, still above the horizon, we see a town. Those might be the stone walls of Jerusalem. Could this be Titian's way of creating a metaphor for the heavenly city of Jerusalem, as Scripture often refers to it? The horizon line would certainly suggest such a reading. But Titian also incorporates visual lines we may not know we're even looking at. For instance, we can draw an imaginary line right down the middle of the painting. I think Titian did that here. Not only does he create sections of upper and lower, he also divides his canvas into sections left and right. On the right side of the painting, you will see different concepts than those on the left side of the painting. Let's start with the left. Up top on the left is this beautiful, rich landscape, receding all the way back into the distance, blending in with the trees and the sky. And then as you come forward on the left, you see the sheep and the green grass. Perhaps references to the 23rd Psalm come to mind. And then finally, you see Jesus, the Good Shepherd. The right half of the painting emphasizes Mary Magdalene. The world of Jesus on the left, Mary's world and her search for Jesus on the right. I think this kind of left-right thinking, this kind of balance, is what we might call painterly symmetry. Jesus juxtaposed with Mary. And notice how Titian divides this left and right space. He puts a tree right between the two of them. That's a visual cue that was often used in Renaissance art. It helps divide the space between two objects. It's frequently used to set up a kind of tension between two figures. Titian used this concept of left-right with the tree between Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. On the left side of this painting, we see humanity before the fall, and on the right side, during and right after the fall. Michelangelo's Adam and Eve in the Garden. You might recognize this painting. It's part of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. On the left is paradise before the fall, and on the right is after the fall. But the line in our painting suggests, I think, a tension. Do not touch me. Jesus is representing that which is now of a spiritual world, and Mary continues to reside in her earthly world. Two people caring for each other. There is some deep resonance of emotion, I think, at this part of the painting. One final thought about Titian's use of line. I'd like for you to look for an imaginary white line with a gentle bending and a slight curve downward. You will notice that it starts at the top of the sky, a symbol, a metaphor, I think, for the heavens. It will connect a tree with echoes, I think, of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. and it will move downward as it flows through the left hand of Jesus and approaches the beautiful red dress of Mary Magdalene. You and I see a subtle single line, invisible to most eyes that pass by it daily in the museum. But it is no longer an imaginary line to us. Now we can visualize how sky and tree and Jesus and Mary Magdalene are all interconnected by a line that unites this imagery as one complete whole. I don't think that is an accident. Titian, seen here later in life in a marvelous self-portrait, was a master of light and line, and together these two strengths of his form a powerful visual expression of an artist with a message. This is probably a good time to suggest some thoughts about possible symbolism that we have seen or possibly can see in this work. I have 4 brief thoughts. First, we know that religious art carries lots of symbolic messages. Easter's spiritual meanings abound in this painting. We've covered just a few of them. Jesus' appearance without crucifixion wounds reflects some of this thinking, as does Titian's clothing him in dazzling white, a symbol like a white lily on Easter morning. Second, Mary Magdalene is clothed in red. That's a traditional color symbolizing death and martyrdom. Mary is still trying to cling to this earthly image of a crucified Jesus. There's death more than there's life. Third, here's a little secret about Renaissance art. Look at the tangible objects each person is holding in their hand. In art, sometimes those items will convey some kind of deep meaning or message. That's up to you to give it some thought. Please do so. In this painting, I'm going to ask you, what is Jesus holding in his left hand? Can you tell what you're looking at? It's a garden hoe. A what? A hoe for your gardening. Mary has confused him with the gardener. Oh, okay. Titian uses a garden hoe as a tool which brings new life to a garden each spring. Do you notice the only living plant on the right side of the painting? It's the shrubbery. It's blooming, where barren ground doesn't seem likely to cooperate. Few artists are bold enough to put a hoe in Jesus' hand. And fourth, look at Mary's left hand. Do you see what she's holding? 4 fingers are wrapped tightly around a clay jar of burial ointments. She's not yet willing to let it go. Death still abides. When you look at other images of Mary Magdalene art, you will invariably see her holding a jar of ointment in her hand. Titian contrasts images of a finite world with those of an infinite world. Meanings are all over the place. If you wish to investigate them, you as a viewer are entitled to form your own opinions. Do you remember the other question that we asked at the beginning? What does the eye see? We also ask, what does the heart feel? Good paintings will always challenge us in lots of ways. I think here is where this painting of Titian in the National Gallery really shines. It speaks to our heart. It speaks to us on a very deeply personal level, I think in a way rather unique and unexpected in art history terms. London, England, in the 1930s and 40s, as you may recall, became the target of Hitler's plan to conquer Europe. Hitler aimed his bombers at the heart of the British Empire. The National Gallery, realizing a need to protect its artworks, began to move all of its paintings to safe hiding places. Secret locations scattered around the British Isles, such as underground tunnels in the countryside of Wales. The director of the National Gallery, Kenneth Clark, arranged for local delivery trucks in London to transport the collection miles away to safety. Welsh slate mines were as good a place as any. As the bombing reached its intensity in the summer of 1940, nightly fires and explosions took their toll. Historians now tell us that more than 44,000 civilians were killed across England in the Battle of Britain that summer. Kenneth Clark asked Winston Churchill for permission to allow a few artworks to be viewed from time to time to bolster the spirits and the morale of the people under siege. Clark decided to invite the British public to come see one painting for a brief period of time. And for a few moments each month, people could come and allow art to inspire and challenge. And boy, did it ever. The British public came and stood in line for hours just to see one picture. They stood by the thousands each month. Kenneth Clark and his staff chose Titian's Noli Tangere for the very first showing. They could have chosen any number of famous paintings to begin these special showings. But he understood, I think, something rather profound was unfolding, something deeply spiritual. With issues of life and death utmost in the minds of the British people, art was able to speak in ways, quietly to be sure, to the human heart. That's precisely what the conversation between Jesus and Mary Magdalene was all about. I think Kenneth Clark was saying something about that in these dark times, a light needs to shine forth. Titian's paintings could do that very well. a painting about loss and dashed dreams, a painting with messages of hope, message of joy in the midst of suffering, a message of comfort in the midst of grief, encouragement where discouragement was all around. Titian was able to convey this truth, this message of hope, all with his beautiful paintbrush.